Pilot tries to kick out black man. From first class, everyone gasps when he pulls out his 6IP badge. Imagine boarding a routine flight on a bright Monday morning, fully expecting an uneventful trip, only to witness a jaw-dropping confrontation in first class. A confident pilot, a passenger singled out for his skin color, and a hidden 6 badge that would change everything. What starts as an unsettling display of bias spirals into something far more explosive than anyone on board could have anticipated. Lines are crossed, alliances form, and an entire airline faces its moment of truth. Ready for takeoff? Let's dive into this turbulent tale. The sun rose over John F. Kennedy International Airport, JFK, in New York, with a kind of brilliance that foretold a beautiful day for flying. Travelers bustled around the Delta Airlines check-in counters, each with their own story, some heading off on exotic vacations, others returning home after grueling business trips, and a few simply hoping to reunite with loved ones. The lines at security snaked back and forth, shoes came off, laptops were taken out, and people gave polite, if somewhat weary smiles to airport staff. There was the usual soundtrack of announcements echoing through the terminal, last calls for boarding, gate changes, and flight updates. Among the throngs of passengers, a tall, slender man named Donovan Carter surveyed the swarm with a calm, patient demeanor. He wore a neatly tailored charcoal suit, an elegant black tie, and well-polished shoes. By many accounts, Donovan's appearance was understated, but those who looked closely might notice the glimmer of a small golden pin on his lapel. It was a humble accessory. Someone might think it a charity badge or an organizational pin. Few would guess it was a top-tier VIP badge from Delta Airlines, indicating that Donovan was not just an ordinary traveler, but one of the most loyal and valuable customers the airline had ever seen. He rarely advertised this status, so the fact he wore it at all hinted at a reason. At precisely 7:15 am, Donovan arrived at the gate for Flight 761, departing JFK for Los Angeles International Airport, LAX. Today's journey was personal. Donovan had a business engagement later that week, but this morning he was also carrying the ashes of his recently deceased father to spread in the hills overlooking the Pacific, his father's favorite getaway spot from decades ago. It was a solemn mission, and Donovan felt the weight of it, tucked safely in his carry-on. He approached the counter to check in and confirm his seat in first class. The gate agent, a polite but somewhat harried young woman named Marissa, barely looked up. She was busy handling a passenger meltdown over a lost reservation. Donovan waited patiently, then introduced himself with a gentle smile. When she finally handed him his boarding pass, he thanked her quietly. She recognized the name in the system, Diamond Elite, a status so high it was typically known only among the highest echelons of Delta flyers. Marissa offered a warm, if frazzled nod, and Donovan moved away from the counter to find a seat. Just before boarding began, Donovan noticed a pilot striding up to the gate. The pilot was tall and broad-shouldered, with squared-off features under a crisp navy cap. His name badge read Captain Ernest Randall, and from the stern expression carved into his face, it was clear he took his position, and possibly himself, very seriously. Donovan offered a cordial nod as their eyes briefly met, but Captain Randall gave only a passing glance before turning his attention to a flight attendant who was juggling a stack of safety cards. Donovan thought nothing more of it. Instead, he found a quiet corner of the seating area, dialed his mother's number to check on her, and assured her everything was going to be all right. He knew she was worried about him traveling alone, especially since the death of his father had left her anxious about everything. She felt that the world had proven itself an unstable and sometimes cruel place. Donovan tried to be the stable rock for her, especially after the funeral, and part of his calm was simply an act he kept up for her sake. Boarding for Delta Flight 761 to Los Angeles will begin shortly, the agent announced, and the throng of passengers crowded closer to the boarding doors. Donovan finished his call, tucked away his phone, and joined the pre-boarding group. The moment the plane's doors opened for boarding, Donovan stepped onto the aircraft and moved to his seat in first-class seat 1A by the window. As he settled in, he took a deep breath, gazing out at the bustling tarmac crew doing final checks on luggage and cargo. A flight attendant, Chelsea, approached with a warm smile. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard. Can I get you a drink before we take off?" Donovan returned her smile. "Yes, please. Just water would be great." She disappeared for a moment, returned with a bottled water and a napkin, placed them on Donovan's tray table, and said quietly, "I see you're traveling with us quite frequently. Let me know if you need anything else." Her tone was cheerful and polite, but Donovan noticed a slight twinge of curiosity in her voice. He gave her a friendly nod, understanding that flight attendants often recognized top-tier frequent flyers. He settled back, letting the hum of passengers filing into the plane wash over him. Families with small children, well-dressed business people, and a group of college athletes made their way to their seats. The overhead bins in first class were already filling up with carry-on luggage. Donovan's seatmate, a kindly older woman named Susan, smiled at him as she took her seat. She was on her way to visit her granddaughter for the first time since the child's birth, and she exuded that special brand of excitement only a grandmother can have. About 5 minutes later, just as the last passengers were filing in, Captain Randall emerged from the cockpit and cast his eyes down the rows of first class. He paused when he saw Donovan. The reaction was subtle. At first, Randall's face stiffened, jaw flexed. Donovan, preoccupied with his own thoughts, felt a faint sense of tension emanating from the man, but couldn't have guessed its source. "Sir," Captain Randall said to Donovan with an oddly forceful edge in his voice, "may I see your boarding pass, please?" Donovan looked up, taken aback. He was aware that on rare occasions, flight crew might ask to verify a seat, especially if something was flagged in the system. Without argument, Donovan handed over the boarding pass. Randall inspected it for a moment. His expression remained unreadable, but his posture was rigid, exuding an authority that bordered on intimidation. He raised an eyebrow, then handed the boarding pass back with a clipped, "Thank you." Susan, noticing the tension, offered Donovan a sympathetic look. Donovan merely shrugged and put the pass away. He couldn't quite place why the pilot seemed so curt, but he let it slide. He didn't want to ruin his day, especially with what lay ahead in LA. As the final passengers found their seats, Captain Randall retreated to the cockpit and the cabin doors closed. Over the intercom, Randall welcomed everyone aboard, introduced himself as the captain, and gave the usual pre-flight announcements. Then he handed the mic to the lead flight attendant, who began the safety demonstration. Donovan placed his water back on the tray, buckled in, and tried to relax. The engines roared to life, and the airplane taxied toward the runway. Takeoff was smooth. The plane soared over New York City, giving Donovan a sweeping view of the skyline and the shimmering ocean beyond. Once the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign turned off. Flight attendants began moving around the cabin, preparing the drink service in first class. Susan struck up a conversation with Donovan about her granddaughter, describing in detail the pink nursery she helped decorate and how excited she was to hold the baby for the first time. Donovan responded politely, though his mind occasionally drifted. He was hoping this flight would be uneventful, so he could mentally prepare himself for what was coming in LA. The final goodbye to his father. Suddenly, Donovan became aware that Captain Randall had stepped out of the cockpit again. The captain made eye contact with him, this time more purposeful and assessing. Randall approached Chelsea, The flight attendant exchanged a few hushed words, then turned back to Donovan. "Excuse me, sir. I need a word," Randall said, his voice loud enough to attract the attention of several passengers nearby. The mild murmur of conversation in first class began to die down. Donovan blinked, confused by the sudden request. Nevertheless, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, following Randall to the small space near the galley, just behind the cockpit door. Randall stood with his arms crossed. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your ID and your boarding pass again." Donovan offered a courteous smile. "Certainly." He pulled out his driver's license and the boarding pass, handing them over. He watched Randall carefully this time, trying to read the pilot's demeanor. Randall scrutinized the ID for a long moment, looking up at Donovan's face as if to confirm the photograph, then repeated the same exercise with the boarding pass. "I see you're in seat 1A, Randall said, his tone terse. "How did you acquire this seat?" Donovan felt his stomach tighten. "I purchased it," he replied evenly. "I fly quite frequently. This seat was booked and confirmed more than a week ago." Randall stared hard at the ID once more. "So you're telling me you bought a first-class seat outright?" Donovan hesitated, taken aback by the pilot's invasive questioning. "Yes, Captain. Is there a problem?" Randall exhaled sharply and handed back the ID and boarding pass. "We'll see," he said, before turning on his heel and walking back into the cockpit without another word. Donovan returned to his seat. Susan had overheard part of the conversation and was fidgeting with concern. She reached out a hand and gently patted Donovan's arm. "Everything all right?" Donovan forced a slight smile, though uncertainty twisted inside him. "I'm not sure," he confessed. He wanted to see my ID again. Susan's mouth formed a tight line. "That's odd. I've never seen a pilot do that in all my years of flying." Donovan merely nodded, choosing to keep his thoughts to himself. He did notice that a few other passengers had been watching the scene. A business traveler in 2B frowned with confusion. The flight attendant, Chelsea, looked away awkwardly. Donovan sensed a tension ripple through the cabin, like a hush that passed through a crowd when an event, not yet understood, was about to unfold. Over the next hour, flight attendants served drinks and breakfast in first class. The mood seemed to improve slightly as passengers ate and turned their attention to their personal devices or in-flight entertainment. Donovan tried to focus on reading an e-book on his tablet, but found his thoughts drifting too often. The pilot's behavior had unsettled him, and he couldn't shake the feeling something else was coming. It wasn't long before Captain Randall was back in the aisle. This time, he stood directly by Donovan's seat, arms folded across his chest. Susan, sensing conflict, shifted uneasily, trying not to intrude. "Sir," Randall said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, "I need to speak with you again." Donovan looked up, forcing himself to remain calm. "Of course. Is there a private place we can talk?" Randall shook his head curtly. "We'll talk here. Step into the aisle." Donovan unbuckled and stood, turning to face the pilot in the narrow first-class aisle. The flight attendant, Chelsea, hovered a few steps away, her expression pinched with worry. "Sir," Randall continued, "I have reason to believe that you might not belong in this seat, or possibly on this flight. I'd like you to gather your belongings and follow me to the cockpit for verification." A collective gasp spread among the first-class passengers. This was completely unorthodox. Passengers rarely, if ever, are summoned to the cockpit, and certainly not for seat verification once the plane is already in the air. The pilot's volume and accusatory tone commanded attention. Donovan felt a wave of embarrassment and anger well up inside him. "I'm sorry, Captain," Donovan said, keeping his voice even, "but I already showed you my ID and boarding pass. I'm not sure what additional verification you need." Randall took a step closer, his face tight. "Look, we can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. If you're truly who you say you are, then come prove it, and we'll end this. Otherwise, I will have no choice but to request an unscheduled landing to remove you from this aircraft. The tension in the cabin was tangible. Susan's eyes were wide, her hand flying to her mouth. The business traveler in 2B stood up, looking outraged on Donovan's behalf. "Captain," the man said, "I don't see why you're singling him out. The flight attendants verified his boarding pass. This isn't standard procedure at all." Randall gave the man a piercing glare. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please sit down and remain calm." Donovan took a deep breath, trying to quell the surge of indignation. "Captain Randall, the first respect your position, but I must ask why you believe I'm in the wrong seat or don't belong here." Randall's mouth twisted. "Let's just say your profile raises concerns." The statement sent a shock through Donovan's system. There was little doubt what that insinuation could mean. If Donovan had any illusions about this being a random check, they vanished in that moment. Profile was a word loaded with meaning, especially in a context that felt suspiciously racist. The cabin seemed to freeze, every passenger watching, many with disapproval etched on their faces. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances. Donovan had a choice to make: quietly comply or stand his ground. He decided on a middle path. "I have no problem verifying my identity, but I'd like to speak to the lead flight attendant or a ground supervisor if there's a misunderstanding. We're in mid-air, and I don't feel comfortable entering the cockpit." Randall's jaw tightened further. "I am the captain. What I say goes on this aircraft." At that moment, Donovan reached into his jacket pocket. Several passengers tensed, uncertain what he was reaching for. Donovan pulled out a sleek, black card holder. With deliberate calm, he flipped it open to reveal his Delta Airlines Diamond Elite VIP badge. The small golden emblem gleamed under the cabin lights, reflecting a status that far transcended ordinary frequent flyer designations. A collective hush fell over the cabin. This was the status that typically gained instant respect and courtesy from all airline staff. People who attained Diamond Elite had spent thousands of hours in the skies and contributed a significant amount of business to the airline. Donovan's name was likely known to senior employees at Delta headquarters. "I don't wish to be rude, Captain, but this should clarify any doubts about my right to be seated in first class," Donovan said, his voice steady, though his heart pounded. "I've earned this status through years of flying with Delta, and as you can see on my boarding pass, my seat is 1A, which I paid for. I would respectfully ask that you contact Delta Corporate if you have any concerns." A collective gasp filled the cabin, an even bigger one than before. For a moment, Captain Randall stood mute, glancing from the badge to Donovan's face. The moment of truth hung in the air. Donovan Carter could almost sense the sharp intake of breath from everyone in the first-class cabin as Captain Ernest Randall marched back into the aisle. The flight attendants paused in the middle of serving coffee, and conversation hushed to a tense silence. Donovan set his tablet aside, bracing himself for yet another confrontation he had neither provoked nor desired. "Sir," the captain said curtly, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Show me the documentation that proves you're supposed to be sitting here." The pilot's voice, loud enough for passengers in the next few rows to hear, bordered on a bark. Donovan stood, making every effort to keep his composure. He handed over the same boarding pass Randall had already inspected, one clearly indicating seat 1A, first class. Yet Randall's suspicious glare did not waver. "I've seen this," he snapped. "That doesn't mean you haven't tampered with the ticket or manipulated the system." A ripple of murmurs passed through the cabin. An older woman in seat 1B, Susan, whispered a distressed, "This is outrageous," while a business traveler across the aisle shook his head. One of the flight attendants, Mark, ventured a polite protest. "Captain, I already verified this gentleman's seat in the manifest. There's no mismatch." Randall ignored him, zeroing in on Donovan as though they were alone. If there's one thing I won't tolerate, it's a passenger who lies. We have strict rules for a reason, and I won't hesitate to divert this plane and remove you if necessary. Donovan inhaled, forcing himself to remain calm in the face of blatant hostility. He looked around, meeting the eyes of several passengers who silently urged him to stand his ground. Then, with measured deliberation, he reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and withdrew a slender black card holder. Opening it revealed a small but unmistakable golden emblem, Delta Airlines Diamond Elite XP. A collective gasp rippled through the rows. The badge glinted under the overhead lights, and in that moment, Donovan felt the balance of power shift. The pilot blinked, his defiance momentarily replaced by confusion. This was a status rarely questioned, a status that granted travelers special privileges, lounge access, and, above all, respect from airline staff. "This is my official VIP badge," Donovan said calmly but firmly. "I've flown hundreds of thousands of miles with Delta. I've paid for this seat, and I've earned this status. Whatever concerns you have, Captain, I suggest you confirm them with corporate, rather than singling me out." The tension in first class peaked. The pilot's face reddened, his authority suddenly undercut by the undeniable proof in Donovan's hand. Passengers seemed to exhale in relief, some nodding in encouragement. Instead of apologizing, however, Randall merely mumbled that he would look into it, then spun on his heel and stalked away. Left behind was a cabin now buzzing with muted outrage and solidarity. In flashing that golden badge, Donovan had not only vindicated himself, but also sown the seeds of consequence that would follow the pilot's actions long after the plane landed. The flight settled back into an uneasy calm. Passengers turned back to their screens or magazines, but the atmosphere in first class was anything but relaxed. Whispers flitted about. "That was so uncalled for. I can't believe the pilot singled him out, and he must have some deep-seated issues." Donovan tried to focus on his e-book again, but he couldn't concentrate. His emotions swirled: anger, confusion, hurt. How had Captain Randall singled him out? Was it solely because of the color of his skin? Donovan had traveled extensively, and while he had occasionally faced microaggressions or subtle biases, never had a pilot confronted him so blatantly in midair. This was a new level of hostility and disrespect. 30 minutes later, as Donovan sipped from his water, he saw the cockpit door open again. Captain Randall emerged once more, his face tense. This time, however, he was flanked by co-pilot Jenna Alvarez, who wore a similarly grave expression. The cabin quieted again, anticipating another confrontation, but instead, the pilot and co-pilot marched past Donovan's seat and continued down the aisle to the economy-class cabin. Curious murmurs rose among first-class travelers. Donovan, unsettled, craned his neck but couldn't see far enough to discern what was happening. A few minutes later, Randall's voice boomed from behind. "I need a flight attendant here." Mark and Chelsea both rushed to the economy section. More commotion ensued, raised voices, passengers standing up, someone shouting, "He's just a kid!" Another voice snapped, "Sit down now!" Donovan exchanged glances with Susan. His curiosity piqued, though overshadowed by lingering tension. Susan whispered, "I don't know what's going on back there, but I don't like this pilot's manner at all." The raised voices from behind continued, and someone wept softly. Finally, Captain Randall and co-pilot Alvarez reappeared, escorting a teenage boy, no older than 16, down the aisle. The boy looked terrified and confused, tears in his eyes as he clutched a backpack to his chest. Passengers in first class stared, unsure what to make of this. The pilot guided the boy into the galley area near first class. Donovan overheard fragments of conversation. Point just needed to use the restroom. Seatbelt sign was on. Cannot break FAA regulations like that. shouldn't threaten to divert the plane. It appeared that the boy, perhaps ignorant of the rules, had tried to use the lavatory during turbulence when the seatbelt sign was on. But the reaction from Captain Randall seemed extreme, threatening to divert a plane over a minor infraction. Donovan felt a pang of empathy for the boy. It was all too reminiscent of the pilot's harsh approach earlier. Why was Captain Randall so quick to escalate every situation? The lead flight attendant, Mark, tried to intercede on the boy's behalf, explaining it was a misunderstanding. But the pilot's voice carried, snarling about FAA regulations and safety. Many in first class began to roll their eyes, seeing a pattern in Randall's approach to discipline, one not tempered by compassion. Finally, the co-pilot gently placed a hand on Randall's shoulder. "Captain, it's all right. Let the boy return to his seat and I'll keep an eye on him. There's no need to escalate this." Randall stared at Jenna Alvarez, his co-pilot, clearly not pleased with what he perceived as insubordination. But the stares from the rest of the cabin and the boy's trembling posture seemed to cool his anger. "Fine," Randall snapped. "But you," he pointed at the boy, "don't move from your seat unless I or the flight attendant tells you it's okay." The boy nodded rapidly, tears still glistening. With that, Alvarez guided him back to economy. Randall lingered in the aisle, glancing around at the watchful eyes. It was impossible to miss the disapproval emanating from many passengers. He hardened his expression, turned back, and locked himself in the cockpit again. When the cabin door closed, the whispering resumed, louder now. People were outraged at the pilot's conduct, first with Donovan, now with a kid. It all seemed so unnecessarily aggressive. Susan, tears in her eyes, reached for Donovan's hand. "This is terrible," she whispered. "And to think that man is responsible for all our lives up here." Donovan nodded gravely. "I know. It's frightening how quickly he tries to intimidate passengers." Across the aisle, a younger woman with a laptop, Tracy, from seat 1C, caught Donovan's attention. She mouthed, "Are you okay?" Donovan nodded, appreciating her concern. Tracy typed something quickly, then whispered, "I'm posting about this on social media. People need to know." Donovan gave her a faint smile, but wondered if social media would only escalate tensions. Still, part of him felt that accountability might be needed. This was shaping up to be no ordinary flight. A few hours passed in an uneasy stalemate. The pilot did not emerge again, though occasional announcements from him had a sharp edge. The flight attendants continued their service dutifully, but with visible tension, as if bracing for the next outburst. Donovan tried to doze off, but found it impossible. He replayed the scene in his head, the pilot's words, "Your profile raises concerns," the looks of shock from fellow passengers, and the relief when Donovan presented his VIP badge. He wondered whether it was the right choice to reveal the badge so quickly. Part of him wished he had insisted on an apology, but the last thing he wanted was an even bigger scene or a forced landing. Eventually, Donovan decided to stretch his legs and stroll down the aisle. The seatbelt sign was off, and no turbulence threatened. As he reached the economy cabin, he noticed the teenage boy in question. The kid looked miserable, staring at his tray table with reddened eyes. Donovan paused, debating whether to speak, but the boy's mother or guardian was nowhere in sight. He appeared to be traveling alone. Donovan knelt by his seat. "Hey there," he said gently. "You all right?" The boy blinked, nodding shyly. "I'm Donovan," he added, offering a comforting smile. "I know that was scary back there with the pilot. You're not in trouble, okay?" The boy's lip trembled. I just didn't know I wasn't supposed to get up," he whispered. "I was feeling sick. I thought I'd throw up. I didn't mean to break any rules." Donovan shook his head. "I'm sorry that happened to you. If you feel sick again, press your call button. The flight attendants can bring you a bag or help you to the lavatory when it's safe." "Thanks," the boy managed, looking marginally reassured. Donovan gave him a nod, then returned to first class. On his way, several economy passengers recognized him as the man who had been targeted by the pilot earlier. They gave him looks of sympathy and solidarity. Donovan realized that this entire flight had turned into some bizarre fiasco, with Captain Randall acting as a tyrant in the sky. 5 hours into the flight, tension and silence weighed heavily on the first-class cabin. Donovan Carter, still reeling from his earlier confrontation with Captain Ernest Randall, tried to distract himself by scrolling through the in-flight entertainment. Yet every so often, he would feel the burning gazes of fellow passengers who seemed to share his unease, as though all of them were bracing for something else to go wrong. A flight attendant named Mark approached Donovan's seat, carefully balancing a tray of refreshments. It was clear from Mark's tightened jaw and the slight tremble in his hand that he was struggling to appear calm. "Mr. Carter," he whispered, leaning in so only Donovan could hear, "I just wanted to let you know. The captain has contacted ground control about you." Donovan's heart sank. "Ground control?" Mark nodded, lowering his voice further. "He's filed a complaint saying you're unruly and refusing to follow crew instructions. He's asking for law enforcement to meet the flight when we land at LAX. For a moment, Donovan couldn't speak. The words law enforcement echoed in his mind, unleashing a mix of dread and outrage. How had things escalated to this point, all because Captain Randall had assumed Donovan wasn't entitled to his first-class seat? The injustice was staggering, and Donovan felt his entire body tense as he considered his next move. Sensing his anxiety, Susan, the older woman seated next to Donovan, reached over and patted his forearm. "Don't you worry," she murmured. "Everyone here saw what happened. We'll stand up for you. This pilot can't just bully you and get away with it." Donovan offered her a grateful but shaky smile. Around them, other first-class passengers were clearly upset. Some whispered among themselves, while others shot Donovan looks of open sympathy. A couple of rows back, a woman named Tracy with a laptop had been typing furiously since the earlier confrontation. She caught Donovan's eye and mouthed, "I'm posting everything." Before Donovan could fully absorb Mark's warning, he noticed Captain Randall emerge once again from the cockpit. His stride was purposeful, shoulders squared, face set in grim determination. The cabin grew silent. Even the clatter of dishes from the galley seemed to halt, as if bracing for another storm. "Mr. Carter," Randall said, his voice carrying above the hush, "I've asked you multiple times to comply with the flight crew's requests, and you've been defiant. This is my final warning. Either you submit to a full verification of your identity and reasons for travel, or I will have no choice but to force an unscheduled landing." A ripple of alarm passed through the cabin. Diverting the plane could mean hours of delay for everyone on board. Gasps and murmurs broke out, and even those who had been quietly observing until now openly protested. One man in a business suit shot up from his seat. "That's ridiculous, Captain. He already showed you his badge, his ticket, everything checks out." Randall turned on the man with cold fury in his eyes. "Sit down, sir. This matter does not concern you. For the safety and peace of mind of every passenger, I must ensure no rules are being broken." Susan stood up next, her slight figure practically trembling with indignation. "Peace of mind? You're the only person making anyone on this flight feel unsafe." A smattering of applause broke out from the seats behind her, and Captain Randall's face darkened. He seemed unused to being challenged so openly. His lips thinned to a harsh line. "Enough. This aircraft is not a democracy. I'm responsible for everyone's well-being. If I decide a passenger is a threat, I have every right to call for removal." Mark and Chelsea, the flight attendants, exchanged uncertain glances. They had never seen a pilot so insistent on labeling a passenger a danger, especially with no evidence of wrongdoing. Chelsea cleared her throat, trying to interject in a calm voice, "Captain, with respect, Mr. Carter has been perfectly polite. There have been no incidents. Were you or were you not present When he refused to come to the cockpit for further identification, Randall interrupted, raising an accusatory eyebrow. Chelsea frowned. Captain, that's not normal protocol. It was your request that was unorthodox, not Mr. Carter's refusal. The pilot brushed her off, returning his sharp glare to Donovan. Mr. Carter, if you'd like to prevent law enforcement involvement, you will follow me and answer my questions. Now, Donovan stood slowly, feeling every pair of eyes in first class on him. He could sense their support, but he also knew he risked making the situation worse by appearing combative. He fixed Randall with a measured gaze. I'm willing to answer any reasonable question, Captain, but not without at least one other witness. I don't feel safe going to the cockpit alone with you. The entire cabin seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Captain Randall's cheeks flushed with anger. He clearly resented the implication that he, the commanding pilot, was not to be trusted. This is my aircraft, he snapped. You'll do as I say, or we'll land prematurely and let the authorities sort this out. A volley of protests erupted from nearby passengers. You can't do that to him. He hasn't done anything wrong. We all saw the way you targeted him from the start. It was chaos, voices rising in a discordant chorus. Some passengers even took out their phones to film the exchange, despite airline policies regarding phone use in mid-flight. Aware that the situation was spiraling, co-pilot Jenna Alvarez appeared behind Randall, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder. Captain, she whispered, we can't divert on a whim. We need to maintain calm for the safety of the flight. Randall shook off her hand as though burned. Then he needs to cooperate, he retorted. Or else everyone on this plane will pay the price of his disobedience. Donovan's pulse thundered in his ears. He could feel the injustice, the pure hostility radiating from this man. Still, he forced himself to keep a steady tone. Captain, he said, I have complied. I showed you my boarding pass, my ID, and my VIP badge. I am not refusing to answer questions. I'm refusing to meet you in a private space where there's no transparency. That's all. A sudden hush fell, broken only by the faint hum of the engines. For a moment, it looked as if Randall might erupt again. His eyes flicked around the cabin, taking in the open anger and disapproval of dozens of watching faces. Mark, Chelsea, and co-pilot Alvarez all stood by, their expressions reflecting varying degrees of concern. Finally, the captain took a step back. Then you'll talk to law enforcement in Los Angeles, he said flatly. That's how we'll handle it. With that, he turned on his heel and stormed back to the cockpit, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The significance of his words settled over the passengers like a shroud. Donovan was marked for some kind of police confrontation upon landing. Slowly, Donovan sat down again, feeling Susan's gentle hand on his shoulder and hearing Mark's quiet apology for the pilot's actions. The hush gave way to anxious chatter, people comparing notes, promising to defend Donovan, some even discussing legal options. Now the entire flight was braced for a confrontation at LAX, the once mundane journey to California, transformed into a high-altitude showdown that would inevitably find resolution on the ground. About 30 minutes later, the co-pilot, Jenna Alvarez, stepped out of the cockpit, her expression drawn. She approached Donovan in first class, hesitating before speaking. Mr. Carter, she began quietly, I just wanted to apologize. I can see that you're a loyal customer, and from everything I've observed, you've been nothing but respectful. I'm aware Captain Randall has concerns, but I want you to know that not everyone on this crew shares them. Donovan felt a small sense of relief at her words. Thank you, I appreciate that. It means a lot to hear it from another member of the flight crew. Alvarez looked tired, as though she'd been wrestling with this situation for hours. Look, the captain is the final authority on this aircraft, as you know. I can't override him, but I've done what I can to calm him down. He has some personal beliefs, I think, that might be factoring into his decisions. Donovan read between the lines. "Because I'm black?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "I can't speak for him directly, but I've flown with him before. This isn't the first time I've seen him focus on a particular type of passenger. I'm sorry. It isn't right, but I'm not in a position to challenge him openly. At least, not while we're still airborne." Donovan nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting both understanding and frustration. "Thank you for letting me know." Jenna Alvarez gave him a sorrowful look. "I've worked hard to become a pilot, spent years in the Air Force, and I never imagined I'd be in a situation like this, seeing a colleague behave this way. When we land, I'm going to fill out an incident report that reflects the truth. I promise." Despite the turmoil, Donovan felt a small surge of gratitude. He thanked her again, and she gently excused herself to return to the cockpit. The flight's last hour was tense and silent. Captain Randall did not emerge from the cockpit again, but an undercurrent of fear and anger buzzed among the passengers. Word had spread throughout the plane about what was happening in first class. People whispered about how the pilot had targeted Donovan, about the teenage boy who'd nearly been thrown off the plane, and about the looming threat of police involvement upon landing. Donovan stared out the window at the patchwork of fields below, his heart heavy. He thought of his father's ashes in the overhead bin. The day he had planned would already be emotionally taxing, but this flight had twisted it into a nightmare. How would he scatter his father's ashes in peace if he were detained at LAX? Susan reached over and gently placed her hand on Donovan's forearm. "No matter what happens when we land, we'll stand by you. I promise." He was moved by her support, as well as by the silent solidarity of the other passengers who had witnessed everything. At last, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their final descent into Los Angeles. Outside, the Californian coastline shimmered in the distance, the blue of the Pacific calling to Donovan in a way that made his chest ache. The wheels touched down smoothly, ironically demonstrating Captain Randall's skill in piloting the aircraft. But skill in the air, Donovan thought bitterly, did not translate into decency on the ground. As they taxied to the gate, Donovan's heart pounded. Flight attendants busied themselves with arrival checks, but Mark passed Donovan's seat and whispered, "Police are definitely waiting at the gate, I'm sorry." Susan paled in disbelief. "This is madness," she whispered. Donovan could only nod, bracing himself for the worst. When the seatbelt sign turned off, no one in first class moved. They all looked at Donovan, waiting for what would happen next. Captain Randall finally stepped out of the cockpit, his expression one of grim determination, and opened the aircraft door. Sure enough, two uniformed LAX police officers stood at the end of the jet bridge, along with a Delta ground operations manager named Jennifer Park. Captain Randall stepped forward, pointing at Donovan. "That's him," he said to the officers. He was unruly and refused to follow flight crew instructions. Before Donovan could speak, a chorus of voices rose in protest from the first-class cabin. Susan, Mark, Tracy, and even the business traveler from 2B all flooded into the aisle, talking over one another. He did nothing wrong. He was polite the entire time. The pilot targeted him for no reason. "He's a Diamond Elite customer. We have it on video," someone shouted. The two officers were visibly taken aback by the clamor. Jennifer Park, the Delta manager, raised her hands to quell the chaos. "Please, one at a time." Chelsea, the flight attendant, stepped forward, voice trembling with indignation. Captain Randall singled out Mr. Carter. We all witnessed it. He demanded to see his ID multiple times, even though Mr. Carter had a valid first-class ticket and is a Diamond Elite member. At no point was Mr. Carter unruly or disobedient. Captain Randall tried to maintain control. "That's not true. He, the teenage boy from economy, suddenly appeared, guided by co-pilot Alvarez. The boy looked at the officers. The pilot threatened me, too, when I tried to use the bathroom." He said he'd divert the plane. He was yelling the whole flight. Alvarez, taking a risk to her own career, spoke directly to the officers. I was in the cockpit with Captain Randall for most of the flight. I can confirm that Mr. Carter did nothing to warrant detainment. It was the captain who escalated everything. A hush fell over the group. The two officers glanced at one another, then turned to Jennifer Park, the ground operations manager. She nodded, swallowing hard, and pulled out a tablet. We've received multiple passenger statements via our in-flight system. Mr. Carter has been described consistently as polite and cooperative. Randall's face reddened. What about the seat fiasco? He claimed some special VIP status. How do we know it was legitimate? Jennifer gave him a stony look. I checked his credentials. Captain Randall. Mr. Carter is indeed a Diamond Elite flyer, among the top 1% of our customers globally. He purchased his first-class seat with no irregularities or policy violations. An excruciating silence hung in the air. The officers looked at Donovan. Sir, one of them said, we're sorry you had to go through this. Are you all right? Donovan nodded, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I'm fine, just extremely disturbed by what happened. The second officer turned to Captain Randall. We need to speak with you about false claims and potential harassment. Randall's eyes widened in fury and fear. Harassment? I'm the captain of this aircraft, and I have the right to remove anyone I consider a threat. But was he a threat? One officer asked. Everyone here says otherwise. We'll need to get statements from you and your co-pilot. Randall spun around, looking for support, but Alvarez backed away, standing with the rest of the passengers. He was alone. Jennifer Park faced Randall, her voice low with controlled anger. Captain Randall, I'll be filing an official internal report. Your behavior was completely unprofessional. You placed a valued customer in an extremely distressing situation without cause. And the incident with the minor passenger, that's going to require a lot of explaining on your part. Trembling, Randall tried to respond, but words failed him. The cabin filled with the stunned silence of a once authoritative figure crumbling under the weight of his own misdeeds. The same passengers who had stared in horror as Donovan was unfairly targeted now watched with a certain grim satisfaction as justice finally seemed to catch up. The passengers filed out of the aircraft, offering Donovan supportive gestures and words of solidarity. Some gave him their contact information, vowing to provide statements if necessary. Tracy said she would continue to spread the story on social media. By the time they entered the terminal, the story was already gaining traction online. Pilot tries to kick out black man from first class. Everyone gasps when he pulls out 6E badge. Donovan was ushered away from the chaotic gate area by Jennifer Park, who apologized profusely on behalf of Delta Airlines. We take matters of discrimination very seriously, she said, eyes watering with shame. This is not how we treat our customers, especially our most loyal ones. I assure you we'll be conducting a full investigation. Donovan, still rattled, nodded. Thank you. I appreciate Delta taking action. But please, understand this experience was traumatic. I hope changes are made so no one else goes through this. Jennifer assured him they would handle it, then offered him an upgraded hotel stay and lounge access for future flights. Donovan, wishing only for peace, declined the hotel offer, explaining he had personal matters to attend to in LA. She understood and arranged for him to have a private escort through the terminal, ensuring he was not bothered further. As he exited the airport, Donovan paused to retrieve his father's ashes. Despite the day's turmoil, the real mission still lay before him, to release his father's remains into the Pacific breeze. The entire ordeal with Captain Randall had overshadowed that purpose, but Donovan resolved not to let one man's prejudice tarnish his duty to his father's memory. He stepped outside into the California sunshine, breathed in the warm air, and felt a flood of relief. Behind him, Captain Randall was likely being questioned by both Delta officials and local authorities. And in Donovan's mind, that was fitting karma for a man who had tried to wield authority like a weapon against innocent passengers. In the days that followed, social media erupted with the story. Passengers had video clips of the altercation, and major news outlets picked it up. Delta Airlines faced a barrage of questions about their captain's conduct. Public outcry fueled the calls for Randall's suspension or termination. Hashtags trended nationwide, demanding accountability for racial profiling and abuse of power at 35,000 feet. Within a week, Donovan received an official letter from Delta's corporate headquarters. They expressed regret, emphasizing that the captain's actions did not reflect the company's values. The letter stated that Captain Randall was placed on indefinite leave pending a full investigation. Moreover, Delta offered Donovan a personal apology from the CEO, along with a promise to revamp their staff training and oversight protocols to prevent such incidents from recurring. Donovan remained cautious. He wanted more than empty promises. He wanted real institutional change. But at least for the moment, it seemed that the man who tried to humiliate him was finally facing the consequences of his own prejudice. Unbeknownst to Donovan, additional allegations came to light during the investigation. Flight crew members from previous flights stepped forward, revealing that Randall had displayed similar biases before, though less flagrantly. His record hinted at a pattern of incidents, but airline bureaucracy had allowed them to be swept under the rug. This time, however, the uproar was too loud to ignore. Within a month, Captain Ernest Randall was officially dismissed from Delta Airlines. The pilot, who had once enjoyed near absolute authority in the cockpit, found himself grounded, likely for good. In this final act of irony, the prestige of his former rank only amplified his fall. Days after the flight, Donovan stood atop a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, just north of Los Angeles. The sun glistened on the water, casting sparkles across the waves. A gentle breeze rolled in from the sea, bringing the salt-tinged smell of ocean spray. He opened the small urn containing his father's ashes. His voice caught in his throat as he spoke a few words of farewell. He told his father how he wished he could have seen one last flight together, how he wished the day had not been tainted by conflict. But he also thanked his father for instilling in him the dignity and resilience to stand up for himself, even in the face of bigotry. As Donovan released the ashes into the wind, they drifted out over the sea, merging with the horizon until they disappeared from view. The moment felt both sorrowful and liberating, as though in letting go, Donovan also freed himself from the tumult of the past days. He thought of the warmth and support shown by the fellow passengers, the flight attendants, and co-pilot Alvarez. In that solidarity, he found hope for a more compassionate world. He stood there for a long time, letting the waves crash gently against the shore below. Finally, Donovan turned away from the bluff, ready to continue on with his life. He would carry the memory of this flight with him, a bitter lesson on prejudice, but also a testament to the power of unity when good people refuse to stay silent. In the end, the pilot who tried to kick him out of first class was the one who faced a swift descent from grace. And there you have it, a flight that began like any other but touched down as a headline-worthy reckoning. An aggressive pilot, a loyal passenger with a hidden SIP badge, and a cabin full of onlookers unwilling to remain silent in the face of injustice. From the tense showdown at cruising altitude to the final moment of accountability on the ground, this dramatic journey proves one crucial truth: when you stand up for what's right, prejudice crumbles under the weight of collective voices. As for Donovan, he found the courage and allies he needed to conquer not just the skies, but a painful chapter in his life. If you found this story gripping, let your friends experience it too. Hit that like button, share it far and wide, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that spark conversation and shine a light on hidden truths. Your support fuels us to keep telling tales that matter. See you next time.